All right, back in the studio. I got Chad here with me. What's up, brother?
What's up?
And we're going to be talking mushrooms today. We're going to be dropping some science.
A little bit of science.
A little bit of science. So,
mycology.
mycology. If you guys aren't familiar with any of Chad's work, the thing is Google him. You'll find him. So I want to start off with just asking, like, what are mushrooms? What are they?
So
Getting a little closer? Like
drop the mic there.
I did.
The best and most basic answer is they're the fruiting body of a fungal organism.
So that's a sentence in itself. Is
that's kind of the basic dictionary definition of what is a mushroom. So mushrooms are a fungal organism, mostly made up of mycelium. Mycelium.
Okay.
That's the word of mycology. Mycelium. And so that's the actual organism, most of which we don't see because it's underground or inside of a tree and it's breaking something down. But that's the organism itself, is the mycelium. And when it runs out of food or conditions are right for it to multiply and reproduce, and different things, different mushrooms have different signals, then it puts out its fruiting body, and that's usually all we see because a mushroom.
That's the mushroom cap, right?
Well, the mushroom cap is one section of the fruiting body. The whole mushroom, the stem and everything, is the fruiting body. So, if we were thinking of fungus as a plant, which fungus is more closely related to people than it is to plants.
I've heard that,
but I'll go into that a little bit later. So if we're thinking of it in relation to plants, the mycelium is the tomato plant, the mushroom is the tomato.
Okay.
And so it's holding the seeds to make more tomatoes inside of the tomato.
And that's where you get spores, right?
Yeah, so the spores are again, it's kind of different than plants because they're their own kingdom. There's the plant kingdom, and fungus is actually a different kingdom. So spores are somewhere between pollen and seeds. So
it's like a in between type of thing.
Well, they operate differently. So from one mushroom, a single mushroom, two spores from that same mushroom can make contact and share DNA and create a whole new mushroom.
That's
so
crazy.
Like, you can't take two seeds and smash them together and make another seed.
I see what you're saying.
Or
you can't take like a jalapeno seed and a pine tree seed and smash them together and make a spicy pine tree.
Well, yeah, but you also can't do that with mushrooms. You can't take a red tomato seed and a yellow tomato seed and make a different tomato.
Right.
It has to happen through pollen with plants, but spores can actually connect with each other from the same parent or from different parents, and share information and become a whole new organism. But
that's crazy.
That's one way.
I was gonna say insane, but I like it.
That's one way they spread, is through their spores. But also the mycelium, the organism itself, if it can tear away and land on a new patch of food, in many cases it's rotten wood or wood chips, pine needles, stuff like that.
Like I've seen you like sterilizing plates for it and stuff like that.
Yeah, well that's for cultures, kind of in a laboratory setting. But in nature, in the wild, or in your garden, if a piece of mycelium tears off and lands on a fresh source of food, it will colonize that, and it's actually the same DNA as what it tore off of.
Weird.
If spores land on each other, they're sharing new information, so it's a cross of DNA.
What do you mean by a cross of DNA?
It's kind of an evolutionary opportunity. So when a man and a woman have sex and make a baby, they're sharing DNA from the man and DNA from the woman.
I get what you're saying. Yeah.
Spores, when they land on each other, can...
Well, and that's what makes them more closely related to us, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's by form and not function. It functions more like plants, but it's very different. Anyways, I kind of got derailed off of that. question. But what was the question again?
What are mushrooms?
Oh, yeah. So they're the fruiting body, the reproductive structures of a fungal organism. So that's basically what their job is, to spread spores. And depending on the type of mushroom, they have all kinds of different ways of doing that. Some grow out of the ground, some grow on trees, some drop a lot of spores, some, drop spores over a longer period of time. Some are very aggressive, some are less aggressive.
Um, um, are they part of the decomposing process?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I
So
was curious about that, like earthworms and stuff like that. And, like, so they are part of the decomposing process of like breaking down organic material.
yeah. I mean, they at many levels. So again, mushrooms are just kind of one section, or what at least what we think of as mushrooms, is really just one section of the fungus world. So you think of like mildew isn't a mushroom, right? But
Like
it's a
black
fungus.
mold is a fungus.
But if you look at them in a microscopic level, they are little tiny mushrooms in a way.
Really,
But they're different. So they're when we say mushrooms, we usually think of like the toadstool shape.
Super Mario Brothers.
Yeah, most of those things pop up out of the soil or sometimes out of rotten wood. Oyster mushrooms and things like that grow on trees. Shiitake mushrooms. Those are generally what we think of. And so, yeah, those are definitely part of the decomposition process of breaking down, in most cases, wood, but also a common kind of idea around mushrooms is they pop up out of manure or cow patties. And so a lot of people think that's how you grow mushrooms, and that's true with some. The agaricus family of mushrooms is the little white button mushrooms you see, or the portobello mushrooms. And those need a higher nitrogen environment, so manure is a great substrate for that.
Not to interrupt, but like when you go to the store, you buy mushrooms. What are those? Are those are you buy just like those white?
So this might blow some people's mind, but the little white button mushrooms are sometimes called cremini mushrooms. But the generic white mushrooms, when you buy a canned mushroom, most of the time it's these. Those are Agaricus bisporus.
Agaricus, but I can't say it again.
Agaricus bisporus.
Okay.
So let me break that down in the Latin. So Agaricus is the family. Bisporus means two two spores. So if you look at under a microscope, the gills of these mushrooms, they have little, I don't know if you'd call them organs, but little things called basidia. Basidia, and those are what manufacture the spores.
That's crazy.
And so they form in pairs. So when many years ago they were looking at it under a microscope, and they said, "Oh, the organ that makes the spores forms in pairs." So it's Agaricus bisporus, two-spored. So that's where the name comes from. But what's going to blow people's minds is it's the same mushroom as portobello mushrooms.
Really?
Same mushroom.
That's
as far as the family, they're both Agaricus bisporus.
Dude.
But again, there's different varieties, just like you can have a Roma tomato and a beefsteak tomato. They're both tomatoes.
That makes sense.
So they're the same thing, slightly different, but basically as far as how they function in the body and their edibility and all that stuff, they're the same thing.
Like when you go to the store and you buy a little packet of mushrooms, like that. So that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, the white button mushrooms, or same thing with portobello mushrooms. The big ones, the baby portobellos, they're all the same thing.
Yeah.
They're all Agaricus bisporus mushrooms, and those grow in a higher nitrogen environment. And those were I can't say that they were the first cultivated mushrooms, but in European culture and the Western world, they were the most common, and they would grow them in caves, actually.
Really?
So they would use bat guano, which was already in the caves.
Yeah.
And that's
so they would take in the the spores or whatever, the
Well,
mycelium. I mean,
yeah. They had figured out the cultivation process where, hey, if we put this on this, which might have been as simple as chopping up some mushrooms and
just throwing them in there,
and just throwing them in the right environment for them to thrive.
So, and what you said is high nitrogen, which
high nitrogen is important, but also inside of a cave, it keeps a steady temperature no matter what time of year,
right?
And it's really humid. So
okay,
it was a good place, before the days of electricity, to cultivate mushrooms.
Humans have had an understanding of mushrooms for a long time, right?
Yes, but we also have kind of a cultural forgetting, or I call it a mycophobia, particularly in the United States. And I'll touch on that in a little while. But the whole thing was they cultivated mushrooms in caves or in kind of breweries and different things like that.
Brewery is a good way to put it.
Well, yeah. Well, in literal breweries where they brew
that
beer,
even makes even more sense now.
Because yeast is a fungus also.
Okay,
so
yeah, that makes even more sense.
Basically, in the same family. So, but the stuff that you would use to brew beer, grains and stuff, once that's been spent, you can use it to grow mushrooms on also.
That's cool.
And you already have the boiling equipment and all that at your disposal. But that's where the idea that mushrooms grow in the dark comes from. Because
I've heard that. Yeah.
Mushrooms themselves, the fruiting bodies, usually need at least a little bit of light. Because
do they do photosynthesis?
No, they don't photosynthesize.
Okay.
But they need light on the mycelium to tell the mycelium where to make the mushroom.
Interesting.
So if you're thinking about, like, oyster mushrooms grow inside of trees, so they look for cracks in the bark to make the mushroom. It's the path of least resistance.
Okay.
So oxygen and light tells the mycelium inside the tree where to put the mushroom.
Right. Okay.
Because if it's a 10-foot tall tree, well, where do I make a mushroom? Do I make it here? Do I make it there?
Right.
It's where it's getting the signal, like oxygen and light is coming in here, so there's an opening, put a mushroom there.
Yeah, because I remember you showing me a video of like a colony of like mushrooms like spreading, or mycelia spreading, and basically deciding where to fruit and not fruit.
Right.
And it's pretty fucking interesting, man. It's like it's literally a sentient being.
Well, and there's some theories around that as far as them being somewhat sentient. And they definitely like have. They operate on a system of mathematics.
On this episode, we're gonna post that video as a link because I want people to see that.
Yeah,
it's cool. Pretty fucking amazing.
On a similar note, they've used slime molds, which are not mushrooms per se, but
a slime mold.
Slime molds. They're very common all over the world, but they've used in Tokyo. They used a slime mold to basically remap their subway systems.
This is exactly.
Yeah.
Tell them to fucking drop some knowledge. This is a really cool story, man.
Well, they put little grains on the nodes of Tokyo that had the most dense populations. So basically, they put the food source where there's the most people and applied a slime mold to it. And the slime mold, by its nature, will figure out the most efficient way to the food source.
Path of least resistance.
Right.
Path of least
and send
resistance.
all of its nutrients, or make basically veins. And so they actually used the slime mold to figure out the best and most efficient way to reorganize their subway tunnels.
That's fucking crazy,
yeah,
dude.
Yeah,
That's fucking crazy. It's fucking crazy.
Simultaneously, they had lots of engineers working on it. And what was cool is the plans kind of overlapped. So there were people looking at it from a mathematics perspective, and then there were people that said, let's see what the mold wants to do.
Yeah, dude.
So,
and that's fucking crazy.
Yeah,
that's fucking crazy. Like, I've heard so many theories of, like, fungus being like the oldest life form on Earth and stuff like that. And
well, it definitely
maybe the oldest land.
Yeah, so it was definitely the first organism to make landfall, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And well, it's amongst the first. So before anything that we would recognize as life, alongside bacteria and things like that. And so fungi fungus,
I'm a fun guy.
had the ability to m- come onto land and actually dissolve minerals, dissolve rock.
That's what's fucking crazy.
Well, and that was a very essential process to dissolve rock to basically make soil to make plants or to give the opportunity for plants to exist.
to even exist.
Land plants. So
Yeah.
there's
Well, you got
probably
seaweed
aquatic.
and kelp and stuff
Well,
like that.
I think this is even before seaweed.
Really?
This is like primordial shit.
Wow.
Yeah. Before there was oxygen, put it that way.
Okay, so
Or what? No, it wasn't before there was oxygen necessarily, but the gases on the planet were very different ratios
if
to
I
where we wouldn't recognize it. It would be like a completely.
if I remember correctly, I actually looked into this. Like one of the first gases on Earth was argon.
Yeah, that's probably.
It was argon and then nitrogen.
So what the fungi did was it dissolved minerals to basically make some sort of soil.
So
And alongside with bacteria too. There's again, this is primordial. This is like before anything we recognize as plant or animal really
one or the other.
existed. Some of the oldest things, structures, and I for the life of me I don't know the name of the mushroom, but possibly the oldest living organism on land. There's these big spires that are fossilized mushrooms.
What?
Yeah. And they basically look like stone, but they're
a
actually
mushroom.
They're fossilized mushrooms.
That's
And so they were able to break down minerals, and then those mushrooms would break down and become more bacteria laden and gave rise.
it's
to
almost like
more
the seeds of
plants.
life.
It definitely primed the planet for what we recognize as life. For
That's
sure.
fucking crazy. That's fucking
And
crazy.
there are some theories that it came fungi as an organism came on asteroids that impacted
Well, yeah,
the planet.
I've seen that. I've seen
And
that.
so in some ways, yeah, that could be the seeds of life.
They call it planet seeding.
Yeah, I mean there might have been several asteroids, a stream of asteroids that carried bacteria and fungus from who knows where in the universe and impacted this planet, and it had the conditions to turn into whatever it has turned into.
And then we got complicated apes.
Yeah.
So we got complicated apes. So I'm going to keep on moving with this episode. I'm going to talk about, so here in Tucson, Tucson, Mount Lemmon, anywhere around here, what's native? What do we have that's native?
Oh, well, so native is kind of relative with fungus
what
because
would you-
it travels so
Okay.
easily. But there's a lot. I mean, more than I could
You got
ever
we have
name.
lion's mane, right? And
There's probably some lion's mane that is in the mountains. It's not super common out here.
that's just personally one that I just know off the top
Well,
of my
lion's
head.
mane has a lot of really cool medicinal qualities, and it's very edible. It's a really cool mushroom, and you can grow it here, but it's not super common. It's a little bit more common in the southeast.
Okay.
But there's, so many mushrooms. So even in the desert, there's mushrooms in the soil. There's mycelium in the soil. Probably most common one that people see is desert shaggy mane.
Desert shaggy mane.
And there's some really big ones that have popped up. I forget the full name of that. It's Podaxis something.
The fact that you even remember that, dude.
Yeah, it's desert shaggy mane or shaggy mane mushrooms. They are edible. There's a few that you wouldn't want to eat that look like that. So there's one called stinkhorn, and you can kind of imagine why you wouldn't want to eat it.
On that same note, like, what are like the nutritional properties from eating a mushroom? Like, what do you even get from eating a mushroom?
Well, different mushrooms have different nutritional profiles, but in general, you're getting protein from edible mushrooms.
Which is crazy.
Yeah, you're getting protein, which their protein is basically chitin related. So
That's what your fingernails
chitin
are made
is,
out of.
what your fingernails, your hair is related or made out of, which means you shouldn't really eat raw mushrooms.
I do that all the freaking time, and you've told me before not to do that.
Well, and Some mushrooms it's more problematic than others, but
What's the white button mushrooms that I
well,
eat all the
right.
time?
And the thing is you're not getting any nutrients from that mushroom. Well, you might get a few, but you're not getting any protein for sure, um, unless you cook it because it's all bound up in that chitin, and you can't digest the chitin.
You have to
so
break
you gotta
down
break the cell walls, and
with heat.
cooking does that. Heat. There's some other ways of doing that with alcohol and different extractions.
Interesting.
But yeah, you got to break down that chitin.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Well, there's like alcohol extraction for medicinal mushrooms and stuff
Okay.
like
Okay.
that are too hard and fibrous to chew or eat.
It's like eating bark.
So yeah. So some medicinal mushrooms like reishi mushroom, you would ideally make a double extraction. So first you make an alcohol extraction. The alcohol pulls out some of the phytochemicals.
Real quick, for my sake, explain phytochemicals.
They're
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but like
it's just a certain profile of chemicals.
okay,
So
okay.
these ones are in particular are polysaccharides. So
It's another word I don't know, but keep going.
so polysaccharides don't come out if you were just to boil it in water, right?
Okay.
So they got to be alcohol soluble.
Okay. Okay. That makes
so
sense.
that's why the double extraction instead of just a tincture or just a tea. So
Okay.
first you make the alcohol extraction. You pull out the things that the alcohol can dissolve. But then there's other things that alcohol didn't dissolve that you get out through heat.
So you have to have another step.
Right. Well, and so both things are good. Like if you make a tea out of reishi mushrooms, you're getting good stuff. But there's good stuff left in it that you didn't get because it's not heat soluble, water soluble.
That's crazy.
So
man.
you make an alcohol tincture first. You put a bunch of chunks of mushroom in a glass jar and let it sit for a month in alcohol.
That's crazy.
And then you strain all of that off. And so you have your tincture. That's just mushroom
Fluid.
mushroom and alcohol that's been steeped for many months.
Mushroom
or
shots.
a month at least. And then you take the pieces of mushroom that have been in the alcohol and really wring them out, and then throw that into a pot of boiling water and boil that for an hour. So the heat extraction is going to get things out of it that the alcohol didn't. And
whoa! Did you guys hear that sound? Sorry, go ahead.
It's all right. And
Say boom.
and the mushrooms that are saturated alcohol, you're not really losing any of that by putting it in water anyway.
That's crazy.
And then at the end of it, you combine the two parts of the alcohol extraction into one part of the tea, and it's shelf stable because the alcohol content is high enough, but it's got both extraction methods. So that's the best way to
That's
make
how
make
do
a
we how do
reishi
we
tincture.
figure this out?
Well, reishi mushroom has been used in Asian cultures for who knows how long. I
Yeah.
don't know. I honestly have no clue as far as the texts or traditions going back, but
That's pretty
for a
interesting.
very, very, very long time.
It's interesting,
been
like how we
used.
figured it out. Like it was, let's take this and let's play with it. Let's just see what we can do. Like, let's throw it in some.
Well,
fucking
and it makes a really like flavorful broth too. So that's the thing is you don't have to like necessarily just make a medicine out of it and take it in droppers or a tea even, but like you can make a reishi mushroom tea and use that as a soup broth.
Well, you actually, you actually jumped on my next topic. Was cooking with mushrooms. Like that's if that'll kind of like
Yeah.
meld. Like cooking with mushrooms, like I've always seen is like a good substitute for meat. As far
Well,
as
it's because of the protein. So it's very high in protein. It's usually high moisture. So in general, mushrooms are good for that. They've got vitamin A. Some mushrooms can actually, if you expose them to more sunlight, will increase in vitamin D.
vitamin D.
Vitamin D we normally get from the sun itself.
Yeah.
Or from meat. So it's really mushrooms are the only non-animal source of vitamin D. So like
Wow.
vitamin D's in milk, right? We see vitamin D.
Yeah, vitamin D, vitamin.
But that's an animal source.
Right.
So it's, I believe, the only non-animal source other than the sun of getting vitamin D.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Like
And they'll increase by exposure to the sun. So it's almost like they're absorbing the vitamin D that's coming through UV rays and storing it in
it's
the
like
mushroom.
Superman.
Yeah, something like that.
So the next one, like we kind of covered this a little bit. We talked a little bit about edible mushrooms. Is the next one I want to talk about is what's poisonous.
Not as
Well,
many.
well, my big thing is how to identify a poisonous mushroom.
Yeah, well, so that's
You have to be
that's really dicey territory.
You have to be educated, right?
Yeah, you really got to know what you're looking for, or at least the things to look for, or the things to.
Like say you came across a mushroom you've never seen before, and
for most people that's most mushrooms. Because people just don't look. So that's the thing, is you really, if you're interested in that, got to do your research and really educate yourself on the types of things to look for. There's tons of forums online of people that grow mushrooms, people that forage for mushrooms. The one piece of advice that I would give to people, amateurs looking to get into like wild foraging mushrooms, is
would you call it mushroomology?
mycology.
Mycology.
Well,
okay.
mycology is the study of fungus.
I didn't know that. I just.
But the for foraging for mushrooms, or like eating wild mushrooms, starting out, your best bet is to avoid anything with gills. And so,
explain that.
So underneath the cap of the mushroom, if it has little slotted gills, like the white button mushrooms that or like portobello mushrooms that everybody's used to eating, and that's a whole lot of mushrooms that people see out there. If you avoid eating mushrooms with gills entirely, you're gonna avoid about 80 or more % of toxic mushrooms.
Okay.
So most people have only noticed mushrooms with gills. They don't know that there's any other thing.
See, like I can't picture it. I don't know what you're talking about. Like
on the underside of a cap of mushroom, the little slots that, the little slats that if you cut into a mushroom, there's like little in the white button mushrooms.
I cut mushrooms every day.
Well, right. On the inside of the cap of a white button mushroom or a portobello mushroom, there's little slots, and those are called gills.
Okay.
I shouldn't say most, but a lot of the toxic mushrooms have that. So if you avoid, but there's also edible mushrooms, like obviously the agaricus, the portobello mushrooms, and oyster mushrooms also have
and
gills.
We obviously figured it out through trial and error too.
Well, the thing is there, if you know other things to look for, you can sluice through it and find the ones that are good. But just starting out, for the amateur that's just like finding random ass mushrooms in the woods, if you stay away from those, you're going to stay away from the most dangerous mushrooms.
Okay.
The other mushrooms that you might find that don't have gills, they have pores on the underside. So there's a whole family of mushrooms called bolete mushrooms. There's a lot of different. There's ones like chanterelles have what's called false gills, which look like gills, but they're not. And again, this is why it's
bait and switch.
It's the importance of knowing the characteristics to look for. If you don't know what the cap from the stipe, from the skirt, from
you got to tell people what you're talking about.
Well, that's what I'm saying. If you don't know any of those terms, you have no business looking for mushrooms.
Tell the listeners what you're talking about.
Well, the cap is the top of the mushroom where the spores are held, and so like if you buy plastic wrap portobello mushrooms, you're usually just buying the cap. It's like what people grill and it has an enormous cap. So that's the cap. The stipe is basically explained as the stem. The stem that runs up. Now, some mushrooms have a skirt and some don't. The skirt is usually on the stipe, but sometimes the skirt is loose and it falls to the bottom of the stipe and you don't notice it. And so there's a lot of... the skirt is a little bit of tissue that breaks free.
Guys, do your research.
That breaks free when the cap blooms out flat. So the cap starts looking like a ball
then
on the end of the
opens up,
stick, and then
yeah.
it opens up like a big umbrella. And so there's for some mushrooms, there's a little bit of tissue that connects it to the stem, and so when it breaks open and flattens out like an umbrella, there's a little bit of tissue left
that's the
around
stipe.
on the stipe, which is basically the stem.
Interesting.
So if you don't know what all of those things are, you really shouldn't be eating wild mushrooms.
Well, that's why we're talking to you, man.
Well,
That's
well,
why we're
and
talking
so
to you.
even listening to a podcast or watching a dozen YouTube videos is not adequate.
No. No.
Is not adequate for identification. You really need to go out with some people that know what they're doing. Read lots of books. Dig into what are the things to look at. Because if you don't know what to look at, then you're gonna have a really hard time identifying.
You're gonna have a
anything.
bad time.
I know all the things to look at, and I still find every time I go out into the woods, I find at least a dozen mushrooms. I have no clue what they are, and I have to look them up later.
Yeah.
And even then, I'm like narrowing it down to like 3 or 4 mushrooms, usually in a family. So even if you're very well versed on what to look at, until you've had your hands on it and you've smelled it and you know what its food source is and all of those things, not a good idea to eat wild mushrooms.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
I mean, so with that being said, a lot of people have mycophobia in the United States, the aversion to eating mushrooms,
I'll eat mushrooms all day.
Right, but there's a lot of fear because exactly what I've been telling people, don't eat wild mushrooms unless you know exactly what they are.
Because it can fuck you up.
Well, it can, but there's not as many like deadly poisonous mushrooms or deadly toxic mushrooms as people think. There are many mushrooms that if you put them in your mouth,
Where do you
and
think that
ate
stigma
them,
came from?
there's a lot of reasons for that. One is there are a few mushrooms that are very deadly.
Psychedelic?
Well, there's that. But there's a few that are very deadly, and the thing is once you know you have poisoning, it's too late.
Yeah.
You can't. So 90% of the mushroom poisonings in the world come from the death cap mushroom, which is
Death Cap.
Yeah,
That sounds like a metal band.
it's a white mushroom, and it looks very nondescript, and it looks like a lot of edible mushrooms, unless you know the things to look for. And so that's why it makes up most of the poisonings. Is most people are out there foraging for edibles, and in a whole patch of edibles, they might have one poisonous mushroom, and if they're not being very discerning and looking at all of the different, each individual mushroom they pick up, they can pick up one deadly mushroom in a whole bag full of edible mushrooms and cook them all up together. And then once they feel sick,
It's over.
they go to the hospital, and you can't pump they can pump your stomach, but it's already into your
Same.
bloodstream, and it's already killing your liver.
Why do you think? Okay, so this is kind of a weird question. Why do you think mushrooms evolved into being edible and crazy poisonous? Like, is it like a?
I don't think that. I don't think that they evolved into that. They just are that. It's more that we evolved to eat certain mushrooms and not others. So
Right.
there are mushrooms that will give humans a stomach ache, but squirrels can eat them.
See, that's crazy. That's crazy.
You
to
know,
me.
there's mushrooms, and so this is another thing that is kind of understudied, is individual people have different reactions to edible mushrooms. So something like a shiitake mushroom that's very common, I might be able to eat it fine, you might be able to eat it fine, and then another friend, it makes them sick every time they eat it. And it's not that there's something super toxic in that mushroom, it's like an allergic reaction sort of thing. And so anybody can have that with any mushroom. And so it's important, like if you're trying really any new food, you should just try a little bit of it and wait several hours to see if
how you feel.
But it's kind of hard to do if somebody's making a big dish and you're over for dinner. And,
Yeah.
but
Like myself in particular, I'm actually not reactive to ivy. Like I've actually rubbed ivy on my body and nothing.
yeah.
Like
But with with mushrooms, it's kind of pretty unique and individual as far as who reacts outside of their toxicity. So, and then there's that's the thing is there's very few mushrooms that are deadly toxic. I think there's 70 to 80 species out of 10,000.
Probably more than 10,000.
Probably more than 10,000 species, but there's, I believe, 70 to 80 named toxic varieties. So things that will cause major problems.
Certain
and
death?
that's in the not certain death, just toxicity.
Okay.
So not even deadly toxic. There's probably like 5 or 6 that are deadly toxic.
Just like no matter what, you're dead.
Well, if you eat them,
Yeah.
like coming into contact with them is usually no problem. But if you eat them,
You're dead.
you're gonna have some serious problem. You can survive it with a liver transplant, but
with a liver transplant.
and people do
That's that bad,
yeah,
man. Really?
kidneys and livers shut down.
Wow.
And that's how it kills you. And so,
wow.
yeah. But so one of the things is the chemical that is produced in your body when you eat some of these mushrooms is related to jet fuel. So
what? Wait, what?
Yeah.
You can't breeze past that. What do you mean? Like,
so I don't know the name of the compounds off the top of my head, but when you eat them and you digest it, in your body, it converts to
jet fuel.
A compound related to jet fuel.
Wow.
And that's why it destroys your organs.
Wow, dude. Oh my god.
Yeah. So
I'm still gonna eat mushrooms every day.
Well, those are the extreme toxic. One of them is Amanita phylloides.
Does that mean that they would actually ignite?
No.
No. Okay.
Because it's in your digestion that it converts to that.
Oh, okay.
So it's
Well,
not
what I mean by that question is, like, say you took that compound and had it outside of the body and exposed it to fire, would it ignite?
It might, yeah.
Interesting.
It possibly, but
I guess what I'm asking is it combustible?
The mushroom itself, no.
Okay.
There are mushrooms that are very combustible, though.
Really?
Well, not like in a gaseous way, but in a tinder kind of way. So actually, that is probably the earliest notable human use of mushrooms. You probably heard of the Iceman.
Oh, yeah.
The guy that was frozen in ice.
Yeah, he had tattoos.
And on his right-hand side, which that is where you keep your important stuff so you can grab a hold of it if you need to, there's a bag that contained a conch mushroom.
I know what you're talking about.
And
yeah.
They kept it
for
so
fire
they
starting.
could carry fire.
Yeah.
So you could start an ember in that, and that ember would smolder for days.
And you could carry it.
So it was a hard, woody mushroom, and if you put an ember in there, that ember would just continue to smolder in that mushroom.
I totally know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and so that was probably the earliest kind of use of mushrooms by humans.
That's so interesting because they played around with it and they were
they probably were gathering wood because this grows on the side of trees.
Yeah,
and they realized hey, the coals kept glowing in this thing longer than they kept glowing in the actual wood.
Right.
And so let's pick this mushroom up and carry it to the next site because
and then we can
if
get
they
an
were
ember.
burning a tree that had mushrooms on it, and the mushroom was the thing that was left smoldering after everything else was ash, they would just naturally pick that up, right?
All right.
And then after a couple of generations of doing that, they realized, that mushroom growing on that side, let's cut that off and use it to do that.
Let's light that on fire.
Right.
Let's light that on fire.
So, so there are mushrooms that are flammable, but
is it suffice it to say that mushrooms actually help humanity get to where they're at?
100%.
Oh, yeah.
100%.